Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this edition of Defense News Weekly, we're looking at the future of America's surface Navy forces as they hit an inflection point for developing their future capabilities. We'll also hear directly from the Chief of Naval Operations and find out who will build the Navy's helicopter trainer, with in-depth interviews, up-close video, and leading analysis. This is Defense News Weekly. Welcome to this week's edition of Defense News Weekly. I'm Jeff Martin. We've got a very naval-focused show this week for you, as we're discussing the future of the Navy's surface forces. So without further ado, let's dive right in. The Navy's Littoral Combat Ships could soon be getting the same brain, as the service is working to install the same combat management system across both the Freedom Class and Independence Class hulls. Now that system would be based off of the Combat SS-21 system, which is an Aegis derivative and will be integrated into the Navy's Common Source Library, which is all part of this goal to get one combat system for every ship in the fleet, which would lower maintenance costs and decrease some training time. And Lockheed Martin and the United States military have finalized the next phase of the C-130J Super Hercules multi-year production contract, which calls for the building of 50 of various variants of the airlifter. Included in this contract are a split of 24 HC and MC-130Js for the Air Force, 20 KC-130J tankers for the Marine Corps, and options for 6 HC-130Js for the Coast Guard. This overall award is worth about $3 billion, and $1.5 billion, enough for 21 aircraft, has been awarded. The planes will be built at Lockheed Martin's plant in Marietta, Georgia. And the Indian Navy has hit a major milestone as a prototype of the home-built Tejas light combat aircraft landed on and took off from an Indian aircraft carrier in the Arabian Sea. This comes as the Indian Navy works to develop a twin-engine fighter for service on their aircraft carriers in the 2030s. While the Indians already operate the Russian MiG-29K, they've expressed dissatisfaction with its ability to stand up to the rigors of carrier operations, noting numerous structural problems. Possible competitors for that program include the Dassault Rafale, Boeing FA-18 Super Hornet, and a potential naval version of the Saab Gripen. And Leonardo has won the Navy's helicopter trainer competition, beating out Bell and Airbus. The company's TH-119 will now be designated the TH-73A and will replace the Navy's current TH-57. The initial contract for 32 aircraft and $176 million will be executed in Philadelphia and should be done by October of next year. But it's likely that Bell or Airbus could protest the Navy's decision, which could delay production. And both Lockheed Martin, Sikorsky, and Boeing have submitted their bids to replace the German military CH-53G heavy lift helicopters. Now, Sikorsky is pitching the CH-53K King Stallion, a modern version of the G model, and Boeing is pitching the CH-47 Chinook. A decision could come next year and deliveries would start in 2024. But that's if funding can stay constant and if the Germans can avoid having the program delayed, which is what's happened to several major defense programs in recent memory. And the United States Marine Corps could soon be getting the Navy's new Naval Strike Missile, which they'll use from shore batteries. It's all part of the Marine Corps Commandant's plan to integrate the Corps with the Navy even more than it already is. Now, this missile, made by Raytheon in Kongsberg, could fly more than 100 miles and is incredibly accurate. It's already used in a land-based role by Poland, and in 2018, the U.S. Army fired one from a shore battery at a decommissioned ship as part of a multi-domain demonstration. And America's first Chief of Space Operations, Space Force General John Raymond, has been sworn in by Vice President Mike Pence. Raymond is also the head of the U.S. Space Command and will now be a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Space Force was officially stood up in December when the National Defense Authorization Act was signed, and a lot of work is going on behind the scenes right now to fully establish this new military branch, which is the first since the Air Force was created in 1947. At the Surface Navy Association's annual conference this week, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Michael Gilday spoke to the audience about the future of the Navy and how the service plans to grow in the next decade. Here's some highlights from his speech.
Many people have said that the National Defense Strategy is essentially a maritime strategy, including the Acting Secretary of Defense, Tom Modly, most recently in his latest Vector 6. I believe that too. And for those of us who have spent our lives at sea, we innately know the reasons why. The rest of America, as I've said, however, may not know. And we collectively owe it to ourselves and our country to do a better job of making that case for what the United States Navy does for our fellow citizens. There are so many ways that our work is critical, but there are three in particular that I want to touch on this afternoon. The first is securing that economic prosperity that we all enjoy. The second is deterring our adversaries, and if we must fight, keeping that fight far, far from home. And the third is providing flexible options to our civilian leaders in any corner of the world, and as C&O Clark would say, without a permission slip. Despite the tendency here in D.C. to focus on some false choices, the truth is that in order to deter our challenges in the future, we have to grow our fleet's capabilities at the same time that we maintain and modernize. It's our job to argue for that growth. It's why we need a Navy. The truth is, if we aren't growing those capabilities today, we are falling behind. The growth I'm talking about is a lot more than numbers. Growth is about increasing our naval relationships, first and foremost with the United States Marine Corps, as well as with the Joint Force and with our allies and partners. We need to pursue unmanned technologies, and we need to solve tough technology and policy issues associated with unmanned instead of running away from them. We need to ensure that our logistics forces can support a larger fleet and that they can do so in support of distributed maritime operations in contested environments. As surface warriors, we can be very excited about what some of our near-term efforts are. The next generation frigate, experimenting with unmanned and optimally manned systems in concert with manned platforms by continuing to backfit our current ships with new capabilities. The deployment of Gabriel Giffords to 7th Fleet with the Naval Strike Missile, a prime example. In my entire career, and I say this not just because I'm C&O, I really believe I can't think of a better time to serve in the United States Navy and in our surface force. Decisive and growing naval capability has never mattered so much to our way of life. It's up to each of us to help to tell the story why. When I talk to Congress, I think I have to make a case that we have to sustain the Navy that we have today. It's been an age-old problem for us. Admiral Brown up here a little while ago talked about maintenance, right? He talked about our laser focus on it. He talked about the trend that we're on, and we're on a really good trend, right? We need to fix that. You know, getting ships out of shipyards at, a rate of 20%, 25%, 30% completion on time is completely unsatisfactory. In a country like this, it's embarrassing. And so we need to fix that stuff. That's where we need to put our effort. I haven't heard what you're talking about in terms of operations and maintenance accounts. That's a high priority for me. Steaming hours, flying hours, maintenance. We are funding maintenance at the highest executable levels that we can.
To keep up to date with all of our coverage, be sure to visit our Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn pages. Also be sure to add us on Apple's News app and other platforms for the latest updates. Now, when we come back, we're going to look at a possible force structure for the surface Navy of the future. In a recent study, the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments revealed a possible structure and strategy for America's surface Navy that has a lot of people talking. So at the SNA conference, I caught up with the authors to chat about it and the reasoning behind their ideas. Gents, thanks for taking the time to chat with me here at Surface Navy Issues. So kind of walk me through why you commissioned this study. What was the Navy doing wrong that necessitated the look that you guys took?
Well, thanks for the time, Jeff. It's great to see you here. And what drove the study really was the need for the Surface Navy to be redesigned, re-architected to support both the fiscal constraints the Navy is likely to be under, but also address the great power competition challenges they're likely to face. So we saw the direction that the Surface Navy was going was in the wrong direction, given the challenges and the threats, and also how much money is going to be available to the Navy. And so that's what we proposed, this rebalancing of the surface fleet and a redesign around a new set of platforms.
So what is that new surface fleet that you guys are proposing in this study?
I'll let Tim talk about that to a lot of that, but the main thing is we're rebalancing the surface fleet away from a small number of large surface combatants, which is kind of today's surface Navy, towards a larger surface Navy that is a larger number of smaller combatants. That saves money, it increases the complexity of the force to support distributed operations, it improves the defensive capacity of the force, and it also improves the offensive capacity of the force and better distributes that offensive capacity. So we feel like that's a much better force for the Navy for the future.
Exactly. I think one of the major differences between our plan and the Navy's is that instead of procuring a cruiser-like future large surface combatant, we propose a destroyer-sized DDGX. Originally, the Navy planned on procuring a replacement to the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer in fiscal year 2030. But a couple years ago, they accelerated that to fiscal year 2025. We think that rushing the replacement for the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer with a new large surface combatant is risky, and it's likely to result in a ship that's over budget, delivered late, and falls short of requirements. So instead, we propose that the Navy take its time to develop and mature some of these key technologies like electric drive, automation, and directed energy that it needs on the large surface combatant. And then in 2030, building a destroyer-sized DDGX that would cost about $2.5 billion instead of the cruiser-sized future large surface combatant that would cost about $2.8 billion. This helps put the Navy on the right trajectory and breaks it off the current path in which it's headed towards an ever smaller fleet of expensive ships.
And so one other thing you guys had in your study from reading it through was the need to increase the salvo size that an enemy force would need to do to overwhelm the surface fleet. So is that adding more capable missiles? Is that adding more missiles for air defense? Other things like directed energy for air and missile defense? What does that mean?
Yeah, so fundamentally, if we're going to have the Navy operating in places like the South and East China Sea, where they're going to be under the threat of a large number of weapons from Chinese mainland as well as Chinese ships, you've got to be able to have each individual ship better protected, which means dialing in the range at which we do air defense. You know, instead of trying to shoot down every missile 100 miles away from the ship, you got to start shooting things closer to the ship, which means I can now use lasers, I can use high power microwave, I can use shorter range interceptors like the ESSM that are smaller, and I can carry more of them on my ship. All of those increase the defensive capacity of each ship. And then on top of that, by expanding the number of ships, you increase the number of targets an enemy's going to have to engage, which dilutes their attacks over that large number of targets, increasing the salvo size the enemy's going to have to launch in order to defeat that naval force. And that might dissuade them from the aggression in the first place, or it's certainly going to slow down their active aggression once they start it.
So walk me through kind of the structure of the fleet you're looking at. Is it a majority unmanned? Is it a majority manned small ships? What's your vision here?
So we saw that the balance needs to shift dramatically away from where it is today. So the Navy is driving towards a fleet of 105 or so large surface combatants, about 50 small surface combatants, and then some number of unmanned vessels, which is probably relatively small. We shift that to instead have a fleet that's only got about 70 large surface combatants and has about 100 small surface combatant corvettes that replace the Navy's current plan for a large unmanned surface vessel. We also add in the Navy's current plan to build about 50 frigates that are going to be small surface combatants as well. So it really flips the balance of the fleet away from the large surface combatants towards these smaller combatants. And also a fundamental change is we get away from the large unmanned surface vehicle and instead make that an optionally unmanned corvette.
And Tim, what's your take there from your perspective?
Exactly. It's a key shift. I think one of the areas that we doubled down on is introducing the medium unmanned surface vessel. So we recommend 110 of these to be operating within the fleet to be able to provide ISR, counter ISR and deception, and then some ASW support for the fleet. So in order to be able to conduct distributed operations, we're going to need many of these relatively cheap unmanned, medium unmanned surface vessels to operate throughout the fleet. Also, as Brian pointed out, our shift from the large unmanned surface vessel to the optionally unmanned corvette is a pretty significant one. We felt that the Navy's LUSV would likely end up being about a 2,000-ton vessel that would cost between $200 to $300 million, but would be difficult to employ during the competition phase. This is because adversaries like China's maritime militia may attempt to harass it, to crowd it out of an area, or could even attempt to illegally board it to steal sensitive components like weapon parts. So instead, we recommend that the Navy use an optionally unmanned corvette that would have 15 to 24 personnel on it normally. It would be primarily armed with offensive weapons, and it would operate with force packages of frigates and destroyers during regular operations. This would allow the Navy to have an off-board magazine on these corvettes that could be easier to use, and because the corvettes would be highly automated and autonomous, if for certain missions during a conflict the Navy wanted to take the personnel off, it could do so and the ship could operate in a fully unmanned mode.
Yep. And so fundamentally we shift the Navy or the surface fleet away from having about 150 ships 2/3 of which are large surface combatants that are expensive to buy and maintain, towards a fleet of about 350 ships, of which about a quarter are these large surface combatants, and the rest are 100 unmanned surface vessels, 100 of these small corvettes, and then about 50 of your frigates that the Navy's already planned.
So I think it's safe to say this plane kind of blows right through that magic number of 355 that's always seemed to hear about. Was that a consideration you guys had when you were putting this together?
The consideration we had was how do we make the fleet cheaper, in addition to making it more capable against our adversaries. And so that was a primary consideration. So by making the fleet larger, but making it composed of more small surface combatants, we drive down the cost to buy the fleet significantly, and also the cost to operate and maintain it significantly as well. So the fleet we're proposing costs about a third to a quarter less than the Navy's current plan if they stay on today's trajectory, which I think is important considering the Navy's already arguing they need more money for the current fleet, and I think it's very unlikely they're going to get that either from another service or from an increased top line for the DoD.
And so that also kind of brings up the realistic side of this, looking at the American shipbuilding base, which hasn't exactly been in the best of health over the recent years. So how do you think they'll be able to build this amount of ships if their plan was put in place?
They could certainly build it. It would be a matter of retooling a little bit to build these smaller combatants in serial production rather than building the larger combatants at a slower rate. So we still would argue continuing to build the DG Flight 3, DG-51 Flight 3 for the next decade or so, which would keep our current large shipyards in business. But we also propose this large number of small combatants that could go both to those yards or to a number of other yards that are smaller shipbuilders that just don't get as much Navy business today. Places like VT Halter or Eastern down in the Gulf Coast. Okay.
And so with that, and kind of the other question is, where does the LCS fit in all this?
So LCS will be a key platform within the fleet. We're requiring over 30 of them. So we considered what are the best ways to cost effectively improve the effectiveness of that ship. And we found, I guess, two general lines of effort. One was by hardening the ship, so by giving it some low cost but high value improvements like potential rapid fire guns like mad fire systems to increase its defensive capacity, adding some offensive capability like the Naval Strike Missile, and then also viewing what are ways in which we could use LCS to act as command and control platforms for other small and medium unmanned surface vessels that will operate throughout the fleet. So as you correctly point out, LCS will be critical, and we just have to figure out what's the best way to use that platform while still going forward on the new FFGX.
Now don't go away. When we come back, we're going to look at the advanced radars being put on the Navy ships of the future. And on this week's Money Minute, personal finance expert Jeanette Mack offers her latest tips.
When things get financially tough, withdrawing funds from your 401k, TSP, or Roth IRA can seem like a lifesaver. But if it's before you're 59.5 years old, it could cost you more in the long run. For starters, you'll lose earnings from years of compounding interest. You'll also run the risk of a 10% early withdrawal penalty, on top of regular income tax that's due on withdrawals from many retirement accounts. While a few exceptions to the rules exist, the cost most always outweighs the benefit. If you find yourself in a pinch and you don't want to harm your retirement savings, apply for a loan from your TSP while you're working for the government or as a service member. The TSP loan program allows you to borrow from your TSP account and repay your account under a set time period. Or consider taking out a personal loan to consolidate debt or cover any unexpected expenses. If your credit score is high, you may qualify for a 0% APR balance transfer or a 0% APR intro rate on a credit card. Either way, you're not paying interest for several months depending on the card. While your present financial situation may not be ideal, it's best not to sacrifice your retirement to get you through today. Talk to your bank or credit union about other financial options for a stronger future.
Thanks, Jeanette. We'll see you next week. To get more defense news coverage, be sure to visit our website at defensenews.com and subscribe to our early bird brief, delivered to your inbox every weekday morning to get you ready to start the day. And don't go away. When we come back, we're going to look at the advanced radars being put on the Navy ships of the future. The U.S. Navy is working through plans right now to backfit much more advanced radars into Flight IIA Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, which make up the majority of the fleet's surface forces. The plans would retrofit a scaled-down version of the Raytheon Spy-6 radar, which will be on the upcoming Flight 3 version of the ship. It will replace the Spy-1D radars currently on board and will likely be part of the mid-life modernization for many of the ships. But as of now, there's no confirmation on how many of those ships could be getting the upgrade. And speaking of that Spy-6 radar, it's getting closer to hit the waves. To find out more, I caught up with Raytheon, where we talked about its capabilities and the rollout plan. Take a look. Paul, thanks for taking the time to chat with me here at Surface Navy Association. So what am I standing in front of here?
Oh, thank you for the time. So this is what we call the radar modular assembly. This is the basic building block of all of our SPY-6 radars. This is a radar onto itself, operates full software configuration, and it has in here a mix of 4 line replaceable units. These modules comprise any variant of our SPY-6 radar. For instance, the Flight IIA DDG configuration, which is our largest configuration, designated the V1, is each array face is made up of 37 of these radar modular assemblies. That fits within the space, weight, power, and cooling available on the ship, gives an extended range and capability of the radar that's necessary to support that ship's missions. Similarly, the Enterprise Air Surveillance Radar is made up of 9 of these radar modular assemblies per face. A backfit configuration, consistent with the space, weight, power, and cooling on the Flight IIA DDGs, for instance, is made up of 24 of these configurations. So it's truly a very modular and configurable radar.
So looking at the number of RMAs that you have, does that mean the radar itself has more power or just more range that it can cover?
Has more power, more range, and ability to track more targets and performance mission.
So the one that we're going to see on the Flight IIA DDG just is a much more capable radar than that.
It's a more capable radar at a platform level. However, one of the advantages of the SPY-6 radar itself is that it truly supports distributed maritime operations, meaning the radar has the ability to operate platform to platform in a very interdependent way, truly knitting the overall radar capability of the fleet together as a whole.
So the Navy's looking at adding more ships to the fleet. There's the constant debate about how many ships they need. In addition, the idea of smaller unmanned surface vessels. Is this something that could be applied to smaller ships that may not necessarily have a large crew and can't support with power a large radar?
It absolutely can. As a matter of fact, right now this radar is designated for 7 classes of ships, a total of 50 platforms, and that's not including the potential of adding to USVs and other platforms as well. We can scale this to any size that's appropriate for the available space, weight, power, and cooling on USVs or other platforms, and once we do that, again, those even smaller configurations can operate interdependently with the larger platforms and allow us to operate across a distributed maritime operations type of configuration.
So talk to me about the power requirements of this. How much power does this use for, say, what's currently on the fleet of DDGs that the Navy has right now? Does this use less power and provide more capability?
Much more capability. Very efficient gallium nitride modules is what we use in the front end of this radar. That gives almost 3 times the range of the current radar and twice the number of targets, or actually a significant number of more targets than that. However, the scalability of it really makes the available power and cooling that's on the ship somewhat scalable to fit the needs or to fit the configuration that we place on those ships. Meaning, if I have more power, I can put a larger configuration radar on board. If I have less power and cooling available, I configure the radar with fewer radar modular assemblies.
But that makes repair a little easier too.
Well, the repair is common regardless of how many modules are placed into an array face. These are the same line replaceable units at the RMA level, irrespective of how large the configuration of the radar face itself is.
So talk to me about the timeline for this radar. 2019 was a big year for you guys. Kind of walk me through what happened.
It was. 2019 was an outstanding year for us. So in January we started off with Vigilant Nemesis, which is our 15th ballistic missile defense test, truly showing the capabilities and unique capabilities at that of this radar. We've been put under contract for the construction and delivery of 9 production units for the full configuration of the SPY-6. We delivered the Enterprise Air Surveillance Radar, the first configuration, to Wallops Island, Virginia for testing, installed in March, and we're operating in summer of last year. We have a second Enterprise Air Surveillance Radar installed in Portsmouth, Rhode Island at our Combat System Integration Facility. Testing is going flawlessly, and the radar is truly performing very, very well.
And so what are you guys looking ahead to 2020?
Continue to develop and deliver this radar. The first array face, full-size array face, is going to be delivered to CSEDS in New Jersey for integration with the combat system environment that the Navy maintains down there. And then the next 4 array faces will be delivered to Huntington Ingalls for installation on the DDG-125. We've already started delivering the below decks equipment commensurate with the build plan of that ship. And as that ship continues to be built, the array faces will be delivered to the shipyard for installation on the 125.
So talk to me about those Flight IIA DDGs that you guys are installing, and comparatively to the infrastructure footprint within the ship that's on the Flight IIAs. What's the difference for what we'd see in the Flight IIIA? More footprint, less footprint?
Different below decks equipment, and in terms of the deck house, where the array goes itself, much less volume is taken up in the deck house itself. This is the equivalent of going from an old tube television to a flat screen TV.
Oh, okay.
Right? The depth of this radar is what you see here. It's roughly 2 feet deep. So you have 4 array faces that fit within the deck house. You have much more space above decks in that deck house, and each of these array faces operate very seamlessly within the modified deck house consistent with the Flight III DDG.
And finally, beyond the Flight III DDG, what other ships are you guys planning to put these on right now?
Again, this is 7 classes of ships. So it's going on all the amphibs, the carriers, both the Nimitz and the Ford, starting on the Ford with the CBN 79. This is going on the frigate, as well as the DDG 51s, the Flight III forward fit, and then back fit configuration on the Flight IIA DDG 51s.
So talk to me about production there, though. That's a big production ramp up you guys are looking at in the next couple of years. How are you guys scaled for that?
So we've highly automated the production of this radar. We have robotic assembly systems that we've invested in and readying ourselves for the HP&S contract that we anticipate coming out this year. We've signed our initial teaming agreements with some of our key partners, Major Tool being one of them. They build the array frame itself. Right? So we're starting to get our teaming agreements together, forming a very high power and capable team, and leveraging the investments that we've made in the automated assembly process in our manufacturing facility in Andover, Massachusetts.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to seeing what this radar can do in the next few years. Thanks for the time. I appreciate it. Thank you. That's all we've got time for this week, but if you want to see and read more, be sure to head over to defensenews.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.